Hello, and welcome to Partially Redacted, a podcast where we discuss privacy and security engineering and related topics. I'm your host, Sean Falconer, and today I'm joined by Adi Polak, VP of Developer Experience at lakeFS, and we'll be talking about data access control. Adi, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Sean. I'm super excited to be with you here today and to discuss all the good stuff around security.
Awesome. Yes. Thanks for being here. I know it took a little while to negotiate our schedules to make this work, but I guess that's good news. We both work for fast moving startups that have lots of things going on. So it's sometimes hard to figure out scheduling. But I'm excited to talk about, access control, security, dig into your background, and maybe we can start with a few basics. So, who are you? What's your, educational background, work history, and how did you end up where you are today?
Oh, wow. I'm going all the way back to educational background. So I have a master's in computer science and with a thesis. And my master's was actually on the topic of cybersecurity and machine learning. So how we can leverage machine learning in order to solve cybersecurity problems. So I used to work with system calls and detecting active patterns in operation systems and machines, essentially, in order to detect malicious activities and so on. And later on, I built the same project for IBM. So I was working as part of the lab as a machine learning researcher dealing with cybersecurity problems. And IBM just opened a lab next to my lab, and they hired a bunch of good folks for this project where I was able to leverage my thesis work in order to solve security problems for IBM, not looking at system calls anymore, but at a higher level, looking at network packets to detect patterns and kind of malicious behavior. So it was a lot of fun. During that time, I realized that I've been doing a lot of machine learning. I've been doing a lot of cybersecurity, but the actual culprit was getting access to the data in order to develop the models, in order to solve the problems. And during the project with IBM, I got exposed to big data and the Hadoop ecosystem. IBM, I think, was one of the first to leverage Spark or invest heavily in Spark. I think it was back in 2015 or 14 or 13 even maybe. And so I was using Spark and Hadoop so I translated my algorithm that I built for my thesis to that space. And during these times, I fell in love with data systems. So my next career step was actually to move into building big data systems for security analytics. So I didn't quite live the security space, but I wasn't doing machine learning anymore. I was actually dealing with the data and the complexity of data and having solid indexing and so on. That was a really interesting experience. And then I realized I enjoy building communities and I enjoy working with developers and educating developers and contributing out of my knowledge and experience. So at some point, I moved into being more active, contributing to open source as a hobbyist, creating conferences and meetups and managing some of the meetups till I'm doing it now full time for lakeFS, where I'm leading the developer experience team. And our goal is to make sure developers has everything they need in order to be successful with lakeFS. And that includes documentation, tutorials, community, a vibrant community. We're doing public speaking, demos, applications, sample applications, and so on. So everything we can in order to enable more developers take advantage of the technology, essentially.
Yeah, that's an awesome background. I mean, it's actually, I think the thing as someone who also did a master's degree that I might be most blown away by is that you're actually able to find a practical application for your master's thesis directly with IBM, which is great. That doesn't always happen. I feel like this, the world of AI and security that you started, somewhat your career in is now like a super hot area with everything that's kind of happening with generative AI. It's a really interesting space that you were, part of for a long time, even back in, before anybody knew what ChatGPT was.
Yeah, I mean, back in those days, we said that machine learning, I remember in the lab that the main conversation was, you know what, machine learning is going to take over the world because hackers are going to use machine learning. And so, white hat folks needs to leverage that as well in order to find solutions in the right time and manner, right? So we won't get behind. And we're starting seeing that happening, how different players or actors, I guess is the right term because we're speaking about security, but more malicious actors are leveraging machine learning to do all those things. And talking about ChatGPT and what it brings, I think, I'm not an expert on ChatGPT for sure. I'm not working for OpenAI. But it's really interesting to see that it was built over large data, right? It's a machine learning model that was built out of a large corpus of data that was collected from the internet. We don't know how, we don't know exactly who owns which data, which actually has another implication of privacy. It's not it's one of the topics in the space of security, privacy of our data. But it's very interesting to see how it's going to evolve. I know a lot of companies are leaning in, actually saying, this is amazing. It's like the innovation of these times. How can we build more things, do more things, build knowledge systems, enable people to be more productive and so on. There are also security challenges around privacy. Can we trust some of the suggestions it provides us? Would it expose us to data that we're not supposed to see, for example? Mm-hmm. So lots of interesting stuff, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I need to do a deep dive show just on ChatGPT and privacy. But one of the things you touched on there is are we seeing essentially information that we shouldn't see, or even in the ChatGPT sense, is the machine learning algorithm seeing information that it shouldn't see, which I think kind of brings us to a bit of the topic that we're talking about today, which is around data access control. So starting with the basics, what are some of the common types of data access control?
Oh, wow. Well, there's so many types, and it really depends on where and how we store the data, right? So the first basic thing is who can access it, right? Who, when, what can they see? How do we store the data? How do we make sure to delete it on time if we need to in terms of privacy? And it becomes more challenging when we're combining it with analytics a little bit, because if you think about a table, and for example, I need to give specific control to people, and people can run aggregations, but they're not necessarily able to see the raw data. They can learn about how the raw data was in some scenarios just by looking at the aggregations. So the whole topic of data and access control becomes super interesting. And we can think about it also from another angle around the different personalities in organizations, right? So if I have a data warehouse or if I have a data lake, we can think through what's the right permissions that we should give to each one of these folks in order to do their job. Right? Because we can harden the system as much as possible, but then we're giving up on the ability to actually being productive. So we need to be able to strike that balance in terms of what are the policies that we're developing, what are the permissions that we give, while still maintaining the system secure and making sure there's privacy. I can go into specific data personas if you're interested.
Yeah, I mean, I think. There's always this balance, right, that you touched on between an organization being able to utilize the information in the way that they need to use it for people to be able to do their job function or whatever reason essentially they're collecting the information for in the first place, but also balance that with the right security and privacy practices. And that is sometimes a difficult sort of thing to balance correctly. How does, I guess, things like role-based access control or other types of controls that you might have on the data, fit into that world of essentially balancing utility versus the security of the system?
I think there's a very important role around how we design it. So if we're looking at role-based access control, RBAC, essentially, we need to design it in a way where enabling people to do their job and getting exposed just to the things they should get exposed. And this is a tricky balance and it depends also on the size of the organization. It's much easier to give access for everything. And I've seen it with a lot of companies. It's like, you just take admin permissions or, full ownership of whatever, the tables. But then many times we are exposed to security risks where the data is sensitive, but we didn't declare it as sensitive, or someone, didn't do the modeling of the data, what exists and what is considered sensitive for their organization. That this is usually when problems occur. And so investing in modeling the data, not in terms of how we save it, it's one thing, but actually who can access it, who has permissions, who needs to use it, who is the owner of the data, who does it serve at the end of the day. And then building policies around that in order to make sure that this is being addressed. Now, it's also a question of tooling, because not all tooling enables us the flexibility of policies, right? So depending on the tooling that we use, we need to make sure we're using the right tools for us to develop the policies that we need. So also when we're introducing new technologies or we're introducing new systems, one of the main questions that data engineers, architects, CISO, and so on need to ask themselves is, does this tool enable me to enforce the policies that I should enforce in the organization around data? And this is a big question, right? Not everything supports everything. Yeah.
So you touched on, I think one of the big challenges that organizations face when it comes to data access control. One is, do they essentially have the ability to create policies that give them maybe the fine-grained tuning that they need? But additionally, they might have data in lots of different locations, and then that becomes a challenge of how do you control or even create policies that are consistent across all those different systems and give people access to the right data. So what are some of the additional challenges that organizations might face, and how do they go about actually trying to address these challenges?
So some of the challenges are not all tools enables the level of flexibility in order to write the policy that companies need. So they need to be able to come up with criteria, requirements for the tools that they're onboarding. I've seen a lot of people or a lot of companies that kind of following the blueprint that they get from the company. It's like, oh, thank you, this is the blueprint. I'll just copy what this company is suggesting to do. But in reality, who owns the data is the company, and who is responsible for the privacy and the security of the data is the company. It's not the vendor that we're buying product from. And so taking responsibility of that, meaning that we're coming to the table, to the conversation when we are purchasing a product or adopting an open source, we need to come in consciously saying, this is the requirements, these are the things that we need in order to make it happen. And there's a lot of ways to negotiate. People can connect multiple systems together, but this is the biggest problem that sometimes I see. There's not always our requirements that people are coming with. And this is usually when problems starts to happen, because that becomes a legacy system, and fixing things later become hard because now we need to take away capabilities from the engineers, from, data practitioners that are consuming this data. And we need to find them a different solutions because they still need to do their job. So the first thing is this, and being educated that this is the things that you need to do. The second thing is finding tools that you can trust, right? That has some credibility in the industry, has some proof, they're working. It's very hard today. A lot of, we can say black hat or hackers are actually, there's known There's known bugs or there's known backdoors in some tools today that people are taking advantage. And in the web, you can find, kind of good lists, or you can buy a good list of where the problems are in some of these tools, even if it's kind of like a 0-day waiting for people to take advantage of it. So being conscious of that and trusting tool that has credibility, has, people behind it that you can trust, that are building these tools, maintaining it, proactive in the cybersecurity space. It's also very important because it means they're on top of their field. So they know what's the latest and greatest things that happens. And also companies that respond to incidents fast. It's also a very important factor. If someone finds an issue and they open a ticket and so on, you want to make sure that these companies are responding fast because it's your data on the line, right? Mm-hmm. So all of these are really critical, in my opinion, for companies to evaluate.
Hey there, Sean here. I hope you're enjoying this episode of Partially Redacted. If so, please subscribe so you can always check out the latest episode and help others find the show by leaving a rating and review. Final thing before I get you back to the interview. If you're interested in privacy and security, have a challenge or issue you want to discuss, or want to share your expertise, please join the Partially Redacted community at skyflow.com/community. All right, now back to the show.
Yeah, so from like a best practices standpoint, it's not just a matter of necessarily like buying a tool, but you also need to be thinking about not only the features of that the tool enables for your business, but what is essentially the quality of that business when it comes to, incident management or dealing with bugs, and how proactive, because it's like you said, it's your data or your customer's data, which is so core to your business. You need to make sure that you're buying something that you can essentially rely on.
Yeah, 100%.
How do companies or engineering teams go about ensuring that like the data access controls are going to remain effective over time as like an organization changes and grows? Maybe in the early days it's fairly simple because they have like one database and then maybe they add like an analytics store at some point, but over time, like you're going to get more and more systems that you essentially have to control access to.
Yeah. From different prospects that I worked with or customers, usually the best practice is to split it into groups. So instead of thinking of one person as a person, let's think about them as a team, right? Let's split it into groups of data analysts, data engineers, data scientists, data ops, and so on. And then thinking through what are the things that they specifically need to work with that data. And now it depends on the company size, right? If we're looking at Fortune 500, then there's a lot of silos, and it's fine because this is by design. Every department has their own data store or data lake or data lakehouse that they work with to be productive. But if we're looking at smaller companies, usually they'll have one or two, like one that is more operational, one that is either they're building their product or something along these lines. So thinking in terms of users or a group of users, I believe can be really beneficial, because then we can say, okay, this group of users that works on this product need access to so-and-so data with so-and-so permissions. This is one thing. The second thing is actually building what I like to say classifications of data. So if you have sensitive, highly sensitive data, making sure you're building that classification into how you're saving the data to start with. So you'll know this is tagged as highly sensitive data. And so for highly sensitive data, you can develop a special policy saying, highly sensitive data, only the CEO or C-level can access, for example. So these are two practices that work best with prospects: is define the groups, right? Know other people what they're working on, etc. And then define the classes, like the categorization, the sensitive, not sensitive, public information, or highly sensitive data. to say.
So I feel like a theme that I'm seeing from your suggestions around how to manage some of this stuff is that overall, like, companies need to be sort of approaching this problem as if they are like just like you would with like developing a product for essentially your consumers or your users of your business. You need to be thinking about like the users of your business in this case, or maybe your internal people. And you need to put a lot of thought into how do we need to essentially split up access to data, who needs access to what, and then be probably iterating on that is probably going to be an evolving thing throughout the lifetime of your business, but it needs that kind of level of attention and detail and forethought to build something that's actually going to be robust and secure and give you the utility that you need.
Yeah, and it all starts with classification of the data. If you have data that is open for all the company, then it might get simpler, right? It's never easy, but it might get to be a simpler process around these things. So understanding that level of security that you need can really help in order to bridge the gap and maybe solve some of the challenges that people are facing in the organization, and giving the right access control, developing the right policy can be super beneficial. And that can enable higher productivity as well, because at the end of the day, if people don't have access to what they need, they can't be productive, right? If everything I need, I have to go through 3 or 4 hoops in order to get it, that piece of information or data in the organization, then it makes it a bit harder for me to be productive, right? There's a system and I need to go through all the steps and all the phases in order to reach the end result. So we need to be conscious of that as well. So our company can be more productive and more predictable also at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to start to transition a little bit to talk about lakeFS and the product that you work on. So maybe we could start with just an introduction of lakeFS. So what is lakeFS for those that are listening?
Yeah. So it's a really interesting solution and kind of a revolutionary in the ecosystem that we live at. So lakeFS provide different primitives of Git. With a big difference than Git. It doesn't use Git. It doesn't work with specifically with Git. It has its own mechanism for data version control. So if Git is for source version control, lakeFS is for data version control, and it's based on data versioning at a large scale. And it solves lots of problems that people are facing. For example, reproducibility of the state of the data. We know today that data is transient, and combining the old world of Hadoop together with what we have in the cloud and data lakes and object stores kind of bring mutability into an immutable world. So lakeFS enables us to solve the fact that data is constantly changing for different reasons. It enables us to revert to a previous version. So if something happened in production, we did some mistakes or something, accidentally we deleted all of production data, we can revert back to a stable position. If we need to build a system that enables quality checks into our data lake, into our data pipeline, then lakeFS is kind of the infrastructure that enables to do that through webhooks. So leveraging lakeFS, we know after every phase that the data goes, not the code. We're not looking at lakeFS doesn't look at the code. It looks at the actual what happens to the data. So after some phases and some commits of changes to the data, we can trigger a webhook to test the data to make sure it has high quality, we're saving it in the right format, it has the right schema, and everything that we're expecting. So it gives us this very broad, holistic capabilities in order to manage our data lake, leveraging Git primitives like branching out of our main data branch, committing different changes that we did, merging, reverting, webhooks similar to GitHub Actions to run tests, and so on.
So there's a lot of it sounds like there's a lot of ideas that have been inspired essentially from Git, from the world of Git for source control. But what are the main sort of differences or benefits of using lakeFS to manage the versions of your data versus just using Git directly?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the main difference is scale. Git doesn't scale. Git is limited to a fixed amount of data. You can't really version control terabyte with that. It's not something that is supported. And so we built the whole system, a very smart system that actually saves pointers or reference to files that sits on my object store. And so object store can be my S3, my Azure Blob. And so it maintains these references to the data to know what got changed. So it looks at the metadata. And the abstractions are the Git. Underneath the hood, it doesn't operate as Git. It doesn't use Git. But the fact that it provides the Git primitives enables people to use it the same way as they would use it with Git, with the main difference that it operates on, very big data that people are using today in their systems. So today people are building huge data lakes, maintaining lots of data. And so they need something like that because, like I mentioned before, we're bringing the old traditional Hadoop world into our cloud environment, which is mutable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I mean, typically, Git was designed for source control. Typically, people aren't dealing with terabytes of code versus what they might be dealing with in a data lake world. What sort of model is used for data access management with lakeFS?
Yeah, so there are two models. In the open source, we have ACLs, where people can define access to lakeFS as a whole. And on lakeFS Cloud, we have RBAC available, which has higher granularity because this is something that we're able to manage. And so we can give better security guarantees that really reach to the smaller granularity, like the file name. You can decide if you want to give permission to some persona or some group based on like the file name of the actual object at the end of the day, which enables the flexibility of giving different classes, right, to files, saying, okay, this file is from class so-and-so because it has sensitive in its name. So we know this file is classified as sensitive and we don't want specific people to access, or we want only our IT or C-level folks to access.
Right. And then what are some of the other sort of privacy security features of lakeFS and some of the considerations that were put in when people, essentially when the company was like designing this for managing these big, large data stores?
Yeah, so all the authorization process is a really interesting journey. We're connecting to, forgot their name, Zero Oath, forgot the name, but we have a bunch of integrations that we have. So that was a critical piece for us, being able to authorize for people to get permission to even access the environment, because you have a UI, you have a CLI, and you have an API. So authorization is really critical. And then we have all the different policies around access, who can rename the resources, who can delete the resources, who can even know that these files exist. So, for example, I can give the highest policy saying, don't even show that this file exists in this specific data lake. I can pre-configure these policies. And the consideration around this process came from customers. At the end of the day, we're building it for customers, or we're building it together with customers. And we have some of the biggest names in security in the world that I'm not allowed to share their names. But we have some of the biggest in the world that defense force in different organization or different countries. And together with them, we design it to make sure it gives them everything that they need. And this is also applicable for the rest of the customers because it's so flexible and enables defining the groups, defining the operation, defining branch protection rules, and so on.
Yeah, and I'm sure you had to go through, fairly robust security review and audit to, sell into those businesses those unnamed businesses that are using you for such critical information. So, what's next for lakeFS? I'm sure there's a ton of things, but is there anything that you can share?
Yeah, we have a really interesting roadmap. I'll say the roadmap is online, so it's available for anyone who wants to take a look. One of the things I'm super, super excited for is our integration with Iceberg. We're building it together with the community, so that's huge. So we can make sure it targets the community needs and our user needs. And we're having very healthy conversations in our Slack around what are the features, how should we go about that, what should we enable, and so lakeFS together with Iceberg is something that I am super excited for.
Yeah, that's awesome, and we can probably link to the roadmap in the show notes. And going back to sort of data access control, you've worked in the sort of intersection of data security and AI for a long time. Where do you see this world going in the next 5 or maybe 10 years?
What we're seeing around governance is that this is a US-based thing, right? Each state is now developing their own governance, like who can access the data, who owns the data, and so on. So I think the biggest thing going forward for the security industry is actually figuring out how can companies support the different policies coming from different states.
Yeah, and even on a country basis now, there's over 100 privacy, or 100 countries with privacy regulations. And then you look at the US, could be 50 different regulations based on each state. The days of just thinking about navigating GDPR, those were the simple days of privacy and security. Now we're really entering a very challenging phase from just like a navigation and understanding standpoint for businesses.
Yeah, it's like, the data community is all about breaking the silos, and the machine learning community is all about give us data so we can build the best models. And the data governance security is all about, oh, wait, we have a couple of 100 new policies.
Yeah. Slow down, everybody. Let's take a step back and figure out what we're doing here. So is there anything else you'd like to share before we wrap up?
Well, I'm happy to share that my book was released a couple of months ago, so it's available in print. If anyone is interested in that, I wrote a book about scaling machine learning with Spark. Some of the hard-earned experience and knowledge I learned about how to work with existing tools and organization, and also how to connect it to the rest of the ecosystems to build systems. I also have a very short section about Byzantine actors in machine learning. I didn't dive deeply into it, but I did add it as for people that wants to dive further. So it's a resource for people who wants to continue to investigate what could be kind of a malicious activities in the space of distributed machine learning. It's available on Amazon. It's available on the O'Reilly platform. I'd love to know what you think.
Awesome. Well, I will definitely include a link to that in the show notes as well. And Adi, thank you so much for being here. Hopefully we run into each other on another trip that you're in the US for. But it was great to dive into the world of access control, data lakes, lakeFS, dip into your very interesting and I think diverse background in the world of tech and security. But thanks so much for being here, and cheers.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun, and looking forward to our next get together.